All right, so today we're going to deep dive into something that I think a lot of developers, especially Java developers, are going to find really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, we're talking about keeping your code base nice and tidy,
Mm.
especially as your project grows, and how to avoid some of those architectural headaches that we all, dread.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we're talking about a tool today, ArchUnit, that can kind of help you, become the master of your code's architecture.
It's like having a blueprint, right?
It is, yeah. It's like having a set of blueprints that make sure everything is in the right spot, just like you would with building a house.
Right. And I think everyone, whether you're a seasoned developer or just getting started, you've probably experienced that pain of working with a code base that's, let's just say, less than organized.
Oh, absolutely. It can be a nightmare.
Yeah, it's like trying to navigate a city with no zoning laws.
Hmm.
Buildings are just randomly placed, roads lead to nowhere, it's chaos.
And that's where ArchUnit comes in. It's like, it's like bringing order to that chaos.
Yeah. So for our listeners who maybe haven't heard of ArchUnit before, can you break it down for us? Like, what is it and why should we care?
So ArchUnit, it's a Java testing library.
Okay.
And what it does is it lets you write tests that enforce the architectural rules of your application.
Okay. Architectural rules. So we're not just talking about like, code and style guidelines here.
No, no, we're talking about the big picture, the structure, how the different parts of your application should interact with each other.
So things like classes in this package shouldn't access classes in that package.
Exactly, exactly. Or, my service layer should not be directly talking to the database, things like that.
Got it. So it's like having this guardrail, this safety net to make sure your code stays, architecturally sound,
Yes,
even as the project, inevitably grows and changes.
and especially as more developers come on board, because, everybody's got their own style, their own way of doing things.
Right. Right. It's like trying to herd cats sometimes.
Yeah, but with ArchUnit, you've got this single source of truth, this set of rules that everyone has to follow.
And this is what they call architectural compliance, right?
Yes, exactly. Architectural compliance, making sure that the code actually adheres to the architectural vision that you've, set out for the project.
And that's got to be huge, right? I mean, think about all the time and effort you can save by catching these architectural violations early on.
Oh, absolutely. It's like preventing technical debt before it even has a chance to accumulate.
Right. Because we all know how quickly that technical debt can pile up.
Oh yeah, it's like one of those, credit card bills that you just keep ignoring and then suddenly
It comes back to bite you.
it comes back to bite you. Exactly. And with ArchUnit, you're basically paying that bill as you go.
So you're staying on top of it. Yeah, you're keeping your code base clean. You're making sure everything is where it should be.
Exactly. Exactly. And that makes everyone's life easier in the long run.
Now, I know we've talked a lot about the benefits of ArchUnit, but I'm also curious about, are there any limitations? Are there things that it doesn't do so well, or maybe situations where it's not the right tool for the job?
Well, I mean, like any tool, it's not a silver bullet, right?
Yeah,
There are always going to be certain things that are better handled in other ways, maybe through code review or through just good old-fashioned communication with your team.
right.
But for actually enforcing those, kind of black and white architectural rules, it's incredibly powerful.
I'm thinking specifically about situations where you might need to, deviate from the rules, maybe for performance reasons or to work around some kind of, legacy code issue.
Right.
Can ArchUnit handle those kinds of exceptions?
Yeah, it definitely can.
Yeah.
You can actually write your ArchUnit tests in a way that allows for certain exceptions.
Okay.
So you can say, hey, this rule generally applies, but in these specific cases, it's okay to break it. And you can document those exceptions right in your tests so everyone understands why they're there.
That's great, because I think one of the concerns that some developers might have is that, ArchUnit's going to be this really rigid, inflexible tool.
Right.
But it sounds like it's actually quite adaptable to different situations.
It is. It's definitely adaptable. And it's really about, finding the right balance between enforcing those architectural rules and allowing for that necessary flexibility when you need it.
And that's really the key, isn't it? It's not about blindly following rules. It's about understanding the why behind those rules and then using ArchUnit to help you, maintain that architectural consistency.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like having a smart assistant
Yeah.
that helps you keep your code base in line.
Right. So it's not just about saying no all the time. It's about saying, hey, this is generally how we do things, but if you need to deviate from that, let's talk about it. Let's document it. Let's make sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And that's what makes it such a valuable tool for teams.
Now, I know we're kind of getting into the weeds here a little bit, but I do want to touch on one more thing before we move on.
Sure.
And that's the actual process of writing these ArchUnit tests. Is it something that's, really complicated, requires a lot of, specialized knowledge?
Hmm.
Or is it something that, even a relatively junior developer could pick up fairly easily?
Honestly, it's surprisingly easy.
Okay.
ArchUnit has this really nice, fluent API. It's very readable. It almost feels like you're writing plain English.
Okay.
So, even if you're not super familiar with unit testing in general, you can pick up ArchUnit pretty quickly.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, and there are tons of great resources out there, tutorials, blog posts, even the ArchUnit documentation itself is pretty good.
And I'm sure our listeners can find some of those resources on developerscoffee.com, right?
Oh, absolutely. Developers Coffee is a fantastic resource for all things software development, and they've got some really great articles on ArchUnit specifically.
Yeah, I was actually browsing their site earlier today, and I saw a really interesting article titled Leveraging ArchUnit for Code Integrity.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. It really dives into the details of how to use ArchUnit effectively.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you're intrigued by what you've heard so far, I definitely recommend checking out that article. It'll give you a really good overview of everything we've talked about and more.
Definitely a great starting point.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what ArchUnit is, why it's valuable,
Yeah.
how it can help you enforce those architectural rules, and even how to handle exceptions when you need to.
Yeah, I think we've given a pretty good overview.
Now, in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to get a little more hands-on.
Okay.
We're going to actually look at some code examples.
Sounds good.
We're going to see how to set up ArchUnit in your project, how to define those architectural rules, and how to integrate it into your build process.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
All right, so stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about, how ArchUnit can really help you enforce those architectural rules and kind of keep your code base nice and tidy.
Yeah, and we touched on how it actually catches those violations, when something goes astray.
Right, right. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. Like, what actually happens when ArchUnit finds something that, breaks the rules?
Yeah, because I think a lot of developers might be wondering, like, okay, does it, just blow up the build? Does it send out an alert? Like, what's the action there?
Well, you actually have some options there. It's configurable.
Okay.
You can set it up so that it fails the build immediately if it finds a violation, which, in some cases that's what you want. You want that, that hard stop.
Right, like you don't want to let anything slip through the cracks.
Exactly, exactly. But you can also configure it to just issue warnings, so it'll let the build continue, but
Yeah.
it'll flag those violations so that the developers can, go back and address them.
Okay, so it's kind of like a sliding scale of strictness,
Yeah.
depending on, how critical the violation is or how your team wants to handle those things.
Exactly, exactly. And that's one of the things I really like about ArchUnit is that, it's not just this one size fits all tool. It's really adaptable to, your specific needs and your team's workflow.
And I think that's really important, right? Because every project is different. Every team has their own way of doing things.
Right, right. And the last thing you want is a tool that's going to, kind of force you into a certain way of working.
Yeah, you want to work with the tool, not
Yeah.
against it.
Exactly, exactly. Now, regardless of how you choose to handle those violations, whether you, fail the build or just issue a warning, the key thing is that ArchUnit's going to give you this really detailed feedback about, what went wrong.
Right, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious, like, can you give us a concrete example? Like, if I'm a developer and I've, accidentally violated one of these architectural rules, what am I going to see?
Sure. So let's say, you have this rule that says, hey, my service classes shouldn't be directly accessed in the database.
Right.
You want to kind of keep that separation of concerns, keep your business logic separate from your data access.
Right, keep things nice and clean.
Exactly, exactly. Now let's say, I'm a developer, I'm working on some new feature, and I accidentally write some code in a service class that makes a direct call to a database repository. Right. So I've broken the rule. Now when I run the build, ArchUnit's gonna, it's gonna catch that violation and it's gonna generate a report that very clearly shows, okay, this is the rule that you violated. It'll show the specific class that's causing the problem.
So it'll say like, hey, this service class is not supposed to be talking directly to the database.
Exactly, exactly. And it'll even pinpoint the exact line of code where that violation's occurring.
Wow, so It's really that specific.
It's very
So
helpful.
I don't have to go like digging through the code trying to figure out like, okay, where did this violation actually happen? It's right there in front of me.
It's right there. It's very easy to find and to fix.
And I imagine that's particularly helpful for, new developers who are maybe not as familiar with the code base or with the architectural rules.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like having a senior developer looking over your shoulder and, kind of pointing out those mistakes before they make it into production.
Yeah, it's like having a built-in architectural mentor.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's not just about, catching those mistakes. It's also about, just promoting that consistency across the code base.
Right. So everyone's kind of on the same page. They're all following the same rules, which makes the code easier to understand, easier to maintain, easier to work with in general.
Exactly. Exactly. It's all about, making that development process smoother and more efficient.
Now, speaking of, different ways to use ArchUnit, I remember in that leveraging ArchUnit for code integrity article on Developers Coffee, they talked about some common architectural patterns that ArchUnit can help enforce.
Oh yeah, that's a great article.
Yeah, can you give us a few examples?
Sure. So one of the most common patterns is what they call layer-based architecture, right? Where you've got your application divided into, different layers. You've got your presentation layer, you've got your service layer, your data access layer, and ArchUnit can help you enforce those boundaries between the layers.
Okay, so like making sure that, your presentation layer isn't directly accessing
Yeah.
database or something like that.
Exactly. Exactly. You want your controllers to be talking to your services, and then your services can handle the data
So
access.
it's like keeping those lines of communication, flowing in the right direction.
Exactly. Keeping things nice and organized. Yeah, another common pattern is what they call package by feature, where you organize your code based on the features of your application. So, you might have a package for user management, package for, order process and things like that, and ArchUnit can help you enforce rules like, you know, classes in the user management package should only depend on classes within that package or, some shared utility packages.
Got it. So it's like keeping those feature areas, nicely self-contained.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's all about, preventing that spaghetti code where, dependencies are just kind of all over the place.
And it sounds like there are a lot of other patterns that you can enforce with ArchUnit as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can enforce things like, making sure that certain classes are only accessed through specific interfaces
Right.
or preventing cyclic dependencies between packages, things like that.
So it's really a flexible tool. It can be adapted to, a lot of different architectural styles and project needs.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the nice things is that you don't have to define all the rules up front. You can start small. You can start with, the most critical
Right,
rules.
kind of the core principles.
Yeah, the core principles, and then, as your project evolves, you can gradually add more rules. You can kind of refine your architecture over time.
I'm thinking back to our earlier conversation about, exceptions. Like what happens if there's a situation where I, legitimately need to break one of these rules? Is there a way to kind of handle that in ArchUnit?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point. ArchUnit's not about, blindly following rules.
Yeah.
It's about understanding, the rationale behind those rules and being able to make, informed decisions when exceptions are necessary.
So it's not just about saying like, no, you can't do that.
Right, right. It's about, having that conversation, why does this rule need to be, bent or broken in this particular case?
And ArchUnit actually provides a way to kind of document those exceptions, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, you can
Yeah.
you can actually use, they have this method in the DSL called because,
Okay.
and you can use that to provide an explanation for, why a particular violation is being accepted.
Got it. So you're not just like ignoring the violation. You're saying like, hey, we know this is a violation, but here's why we're okay with it in this specific instance.
Exactly. Exactly. It's all about, maintaining that transparency and making sure that everyone understands, the reasoning behind those decisions.
So it's really about, fostering that communication and that shared understanding within the team.
Exactly, exactly. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're usually gonna, we're gonna get into some more practical tips and best practices for, writing effective Arch unit tests. And we'll talk about, how to handle those exceptions gracefully and how to, really integrate ArchUnit into your overall development workflow.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. Welcome back. So we've talked a lot about, how ArchUnit works, how it helps you enforce architectural rules.
Mhm.
Um, and, we even touched on, handling exceptions and things like that. But now I want to kind of shift the focus to, you know, writing those ArchUnit tests effectively. Like what are some of the best practices, the things to keep in mind when you're actually crafting those tests?
Yeah, because I think, one of the things that's really cool about ArchUnit is that, it's built on top of JUnit. So it's using the same framework that we're already familiar with for, writing our unit
Right,
tests.
exactly. So it's not like you're learning a whole new testing framework or anything like that. It's just kind of like a layer on top of JNet.
Right. So we can kind of leverage all that knowledge and experience that we already have with unit testing. Exactly. Exactly. And a lot of the same principles apply. You want to keep your tests concise, you want to make sure they're focused, you want to make sure they're easy to understand.
Right. Each test should be, testing one specific thing.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the things I really like about ArchUnit's DSL is that, it allows you to write those tests in a very readable way. It almost feels like you're writing plain English.
Yeah, and I remember seeing some really good examples of that in the Developers Coffee article that we mentioned earlier, leveraging ArchUnit for code integrity.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. They had some really nice, clear examples of, how to write those ArchUnit tests in a very expressive way.
Yeah, and I think that readability is really important, especially when you're working on a team,
Yeah.
because you want to make sure that everybody can understand those tests, what they're doing, why they're there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, another thing to keep in mind is that documentation, we talked about exceptions earlier, but, even when you're not necessarily dealing with an exception, it's still a good idea to document those rules, to explain why you have them in place, what they're trying to achieve.
So it's not just about, the code itself, it's about the intent behind the code.
Exactly. Exactly. Because, 6 months down the line, someone might come along and say, hey, why do we have this rule? It doesn't seem to make sense anymore. And if you have that documentation there, it helps to kind of keep that knowledge alive.
Right, it's like leaving a breadcrumb trail for future developers,
Well,
to understand the decisions that were made and why the architecture is the way it is.
exactly, exactly. And beyond just writing those tests, it's also important to think about how you're going to integrate ArchUnit into your development workflow.
Right, because we don't want it to be like this separate thing that we have to, manually run every now and then. We want it to be part of the automated build process, right?
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. You want those checks to be running automatically, every time someone commits code so that you can catch those violations early and prevent them from, making it into production.
Right, so it's like having that safety net there, constantly checking to make sure that nothing's gone awry.
Exactly, exactly. It's all about, that continuous feedback loop, making sure that your architecture is staying healthy and that your code is meeting those standards that you've set out.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, I want to kind of recap some of the key takeaways, for our listeners who are thinking about using ArchUnit. What are some of the things they should remember?
Sure. Well, first of all, remember that Arch unit tests are still unit tests.
Yeah.
It's just a different focus. Instead of testing the functionality of a specific method, you're testing the architecture of your application.
Right. So keep those tests clear, keep them concise, keep them focused on one specific rule.
Exactly, exactly. And, take advantage of that DSL, that domain specific language. It's really powerful. It lets you write those tests in a very readable, maintainable way.
And don't forget about documentation. Document those rules, document those exceptions, make sure everybody understands why those decisions were made.
Absolutely. And finally, integrate ArchUnit into your build process. Make sure those checks are running automatically so you can catch those violations early and keep your architecture healthy.
That's fantastic advice. I think
Cool.
we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about, what ArchUnit is, why it's valuable, how to use it effectively, how to handle exceptions, how to integrate it into your workflow.
Yeah, it's been a good discussion.
And I think, for any developers out there who are looking to, level up their Java skills, build more maintainable software, ArchUnit is definitely a tool that you should check out.
Oh, absolutely. It's a must-have in any Java developer's toolbox.
And if you're looking for more information, more resources, we've mentioned developerscoffee.com a couple times. Definitely check out their site. They've got some fantastic articles on ArchUnit and just, software development best practices in general.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove of information over there.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ArchUnit. We hope you learned something, and we hope you're excited to start using it in your own projects. And until next time, happy coding, everyone.
Happy code, people.